Go ahead.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Jennifer Fielding, and I am a research librarian, and I work at Northern Essex Community College. And today I've been invited to talk to you all about a session that I run called Think Like a Fact Checker. So just to give you a little bit of background about me and this session and how I got to be invited to talk to you. I am a librarian. I have a master's in library science from Southern Connecticut State University. This is my field of study. I study information, how it flows, what we do with it, how we cite it, how we work with it. And I'm here today by invitation of the Senior Center and through the Northern Essex Community College Speakers Bureau, which has a number of different speakers from the college that talk about all kinds of topics. But considering where we are today, we thought that this would be an excellent session as we head into, sort of our, for me, it's a new academic year, but we are at a point where there's lots going on in the world. So getting good information about it is an important thing. Right now, everybody is muted. We are going to leave time for questions at the end, so we'll unmute folks at the end. If you have a burning question you'd like to write down so you don't forget about it, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll come back to it at the end when we open things up for questions. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen because we're going to do a bit of a presentation together. And we're going to come in and out of that presentation as we talk about how we can better deal with the information in our lives. So give me a moment to share my screen and get that started. Okay, so let's start there. So can everybody see my screen? Give me a nod if the answer is yes. Okay, great. All right, so this is Think Like a Fact Checker. And what I want to talk about a little bit is why this is important. What is it that makes this a critical skill for folks these days? And really it comes down to something like this. There's so much happening in the world right now. We are overloaded with information. We rely on digital information all the time, whether we're always realizing we are or not. And we hear all these stories and all of this news and all of this conversation around ideas of fake news and fact checking and disinformation. Who can we trust in the media? Is our information being manipulated by other actors, by either side? What is it? How do we discern what is true and what is fact? And that's an important thing that we kind of need to wrap our heads around because we are inundated with information. And this is a little bit different than our information world has looked in the past. So we're going to start actually by talking about where we are and how we got here. So pre-internet era, and I am pre-internet era. So I remember growing up without computers. I didn't have, a phone in my pocket. And so pre-internet era, we had gatekeepers for our information, editors, fact checkers, journalism newsrooms, anybody who worked in a publishing house. We have these models in our heads, if we grew up before the internet, of how information got from point A to point B. You had an author or an expert or somebody who knew what they were talking about. They submitted that information to be published in some way, either published or broadcast. And then before it got published or broadcast, though, it went through a process of some sort. Somebody looked at it, probably fact checked it, and worked with that information. So this had, a downside. Very often those gatekeepers kept certain voices from being heard. We didn't always get sort of other points of view. But there was also a level of trust and confidence that once we were looking at some information, it was pretty solid. That what I call factfulness of it. We could rely on the fact that somebody had looked at it, somebody who knew something about the topic had reviewed it, and now we're looking at it. It might still have a personal opinion or a bias or a slant, but it wasn't just sort of wholesale, out there. the digital world post-internet. So basically like from about 2000 on, when the World Wide Web, the World Wide Web as we know it, the way that people like us interact with it. It's sort of like the very late 1990s, early 2000s is when we really started getting the digital world, so to speak. And that leveled the playing field. Those marginalized voices that I was talking about, folks who perhaps couldn't get picked up by mainstream media, are able to actually get an opinion out there. So that's a bonus. It's easier to connect with people. It's easier to see what, your friends on the West Coast are doing, or what folks you went to high school with are doing. And so it's a lot easier to pick up the threads and to connect with folks. But on the flip side of that, those gates are gone. We tend to think about the internet the way we used to think about print media, that there's somebody in between us and the information. And that's not true anymore. The information is just there, and anybody can publish that information. So there are no gates to creating information, which means that onus, that burden of determining if something is true or not, falls on us. Because there isn't anybody standing between us and the information. So this is an important thing when we start to think about, where we go to get our information. And most of the time it's online. So according to, a Pew Research report from 2019, and this is one little snippet from that whole report. It's a really fascinating report that talks about where people get their information. Specifically, they were asking about news in this case. And they asked people, where do you get your news? And over 89% of Americans at the time said that they got at least some of their news online. And more people today get their news from social media, scrolling through our social media feeds, right? And then we click out to a story, than from print newspapers. And so because we're in this sort of mediated atmosphere, we're getting our news from many, many, many different kinds of sources, some of which still have editors and fact checkers, and many of which don't. So that immediately puts us in a place where we should be thinking twice about what we read online. But it isn't just about news. So we rely on the digital world to provide us answers for many, many different kinds of things. We have information tasks all the time. So I'm a librarian and I work in higher education. So I work with students who have things like research projects. And the way we frame it in higher education is called information literacy, or being literate about information, where it comes from, how we use it, things like that. So a lot of people associate that idea with research. I'm researching something, and research sounds like something you do in school. But in reality, we're researching all the time. We have information tasks that affect our regular lives every day. A family member is diagnosed with a medical condition. We need really good information in that case. Maybe your local officials are debating a bill about fracking. What is it? Is it harmful? Is it not? We need good information to be able to weigh in on that appropriately. A friend proposes an investment opportunity. And they hand you an online market report, and you're like, well, where did this report come from? Is it, if we're investing money in something, we should really want to know whether this is solid or not. Or local schools are considering going to a year-round model. These are the kinds of information tasks that we don't normally think of as research, but it's critically important to have reliable, credible information about. And so we need this kind of information in our everyday lives, but more often than not, we're turning to the web to answer those questions. We're Googling it, we're figuring, we're just typing it in and we're going. And so this is fundamentally different than a broadcast media model, which many of us grew up with, where there's a gatekeepered place in front of us to help us discern what that good, quote unquote, information really is. We're kind of on our own to figure it out. So why don't we want to just Google and go? Google's right there, right? So I often get questions like, why do we need libraries now that there's Google? And there's a long answer to that, but we're going to cover a little bit today. But part of the reason is that there's a lot of traffic out online that isn't actually human. And that's the first thing to realize, is that over 37% of all internet content is generated by bots. And if you don't know what a bot is, it's basically like a little algorithmic program. And what it does is it searches text online. And when it finds certain types of text, it responds immediately with another sort of pre-canned kind of piece of text. We see this on Twitter a lot, if anybody is out on Twitter, where somebody types something about, say, climate change, and there's an immediate response, either fomenting divisiveness in the conversation or something along those lines. And what that might be is not even an actual person replying. And this particular graphic on the side talks a little bit about how much of internet traffic is actually ascribed to what we call bad bots. In other words, bots that are either giving bad information, redirecting to other sites, or specifically designed to kind of chime in on a conversation that isn't actually true. Good bots, which are there to answer a question. You go to a website and it says, a little chat box shows up saying, how can I help you? That's what we would call a good bot. And then humans are the yellow. So as you can see, based on certain types of content online, a lot of that traffic is based on bots, and not all of it good. The top is financial, and then education, IT services. So there's lots of little algorithmic things happening behind the scenes of almost every interaction we have online. To complicate that, over 2/3 of people can't really, when you're looking at a website, because there's a lot of really great designers out there, tell the difference between sponsored content, meaning advertising essentially, and an actual news story. And because it's labeled, it has to be labeled in some ways, but it's usually very subtle. And sometimes it's very difficult to tell what is designed to be selling you something and what is designed to be informing you of something. So web design has gotten very sophisticated. It's a lot harder to tell what's a site that is designed to sell and what's a site that's theoretically supposed to be to inform. And all of this leads to a place where over 60% of Americans say they encounter conflicting reports about the same event. And that leaves us in a place where we're like, well, what is true? How can we figure that out? If this particular site I went to is saying this, and this particular site that I went to is saying that, how do I know what's true? And a lot of times people just sort of throw up their hands and say, well, I can't know anything's true. And it leads to sort of this place of helplessness, which is why sessions like this are so important, because there are things we can do to help us discern what's true and what's not, or what's credible and what's not. So complicating this whole picture is something that all of our online platforms are doing, which is what I like to call the personalization problem. So no matter where you go online, whether you're on Google, whether you're on Facebook, are you on Amazon, YouTube, if you're online and on any one of the big major platforms, all of them are engaging in something, some form of personalization, which is essentially manipulating your results. And what they do is that they take a look at where you've gone before. That's one of the biggest things that indicates what you're going to see next. So if I go to a YouTube and I start to look at old 80s music videos, because that is my generation, it's going to notice that I looked at old 80s music videos, and it's going to show me more old 80s music videos. So that's very typical. It's auto playing for me. You liked this, great, we're going to show you more of it. But this can get you walking down a rabbit hole very quickly when, let's say, for instance, the thing that I look up is flat Earth theory, right? This idea that somehow the Earth is not round, that it is flat. And it's a conspiracy theory that has been debunked many, many, many times because obviously we've flown to the moon. So, however, there's still a big bunch of people out there who think that the Earth is flat. And if you go to YouTube and you type in something like flat Earth theory, and you watch a video on that, YouTube will automatically say, oh, you like this idea. We're going to show you more of the same thing. So you start watching videos because YouTube is feeding you the same kind of thing. And now all of a sudden, if there's multiple videos about this, it must be something that's true, when in reality, that's not the case at all. So these sort of algorithmic things that are happening behind the scenes can actually feed us information that confirms our own biases, which puts us in a very unusual place when we're online. So human psychology doesn't help us here. And I make a point of saying this to my students. It doesn't matter if you're a brand new college student or a librarian or somebody who has years and years of, say, business experience. We all have kind of the same psychological predilections that make us susceptible to the way some information happens online. So for instance, autofill. If you start typing something into Google, Google finishes your thought for you. That creates what we call a priming effect. What that does is it sort of predisposes you to take that idea of what was suggested as opposed to what your original idea was. So when something autofills for you, or you start typing a question into Google and it finishes the thought for you, that's priming you to go towards certain content. And your autofill will change based on what you've searched for before. Autoplay reinforces that confirmation bias, right? I already believe that the earth is flat, which it isn't, by the way. But if I believe that and I start watching things about that and it starts feeding me more of the same thing, I'm more likely to believe that that particular theory is true, whether there's any fact basis to it or not. And something else that Google does that is very difficult to get around is it ranks it. Here's the #1 result. But ranking implies value. So for instance, and there's lots of psychological experiments that kind of bolster this idea, is if I hand you a piece of paper with 10 items on it, and they're labeled 1 to 10, and even if I tell you that's a perfectly random ranking, the numbers don't mean anything, right? You're still going to ascribe more weight to the thing that's at the top of the list. It's a very human thing to do. It's ranking value that happens across education levels, disciplines, etc. But if I show you something that's a list of 10, you're going to think the thing at the top is the best, whether it is or not. But because we're being personalized to, the thing at the top of our list might actually just be the thing that the algorithm thinks we want to see based on what we've already searched for. So what's on that first page of results may or may not actually be true at all. And that's where we get into a little bit of trouble when we're online. So this is what we call what we call sort of in my biz, in the library biz, a filter bubble, right? So what we do online is shaping what we see. Some of this is coming from our active choices, right? Who we follow online, who we friend on our Facebook, things like that. And we are actively shaping what we see online. And we tend to follow people who are similar minded. Again, that's a psychological thing. We're much more comfortable in spaces where everybody's agreeing with us. And we've all sort of unfriended people on Facebook because they don't agree with us, but because it's uncomfortable to sit in those kinds of spaces. But what that means is that we're now surrounded by people or opinions or thoughts that just reiterate and re-echo what we think. And that makes it a little more difficult to cross the divide when we run across somebody who doesn't think what we think. In addition to that, our online activity, our searches, our GPS locations, right? If we have a phone, our GPS is on, our email, our social media, our shopping, it's all tracked and shared among these big tech platforms. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you searched for something on Google or on Amazon that you were thinking about buying, and then you go over maybe to Facebook or Instagram and you see an ad for that thing, which is a little Orwellian, in my opinion. It's the kind of thing that keeps librarians up at night. But that's because all of these big tech platforms are sharing your information so that they can better personalize their information to you. And again, personalization has its bonuses. If I liked this book, I'll probably like that book. But it also, when we get talking about information, it can easily lead us down those rabbit holes and put us in our own little bubble. So if we're searching for those same things, if everybody on this call pulled out, either their tablet or their phone or their laptop, and we all brought up Google and we all searched for exactly the same thing, we'd all get different results based on where we'd gone online before and what we'd done before and who we follow and what we've bought. and what we put in our cart and didn't buy. All of those things the algorithms are keeping track of. And so what it's going to put at the top of our searches is going to be different for everybody. There's no such thing as an objective Google search. It doesn't exist. So when you think about what we think psychologically, that the first thing is best, but everybody's getting something different that's first, the problem becomes really apparent. So I get a lot of questions these days about propaganda. We're hearing a lot about interference from various places about our elections, about our information. And the way that's working today, again, sort of pre-digital folk like me, when we hear the word propaganda, we have a tendency to think of sort of old school reinforcement of a consistent narrative. In other words, pre-digital age, if propaganda was happening, it was this drowning out of other viewpoints. We think of things like leaflets or posters. We think of state media. We think of a state-run newspaper, things like that. In the digital world, that looks very different because there's no way to have a consistent narrative. Everybody's curating their own experience online. Algorithms are curating it behind the scenes, and we're curating it on the front end by who we follow and what we choose. So it's impossible to have that kind of old school propaganda mindset that we used to have before the internet. The internet changed that. Now the new strategy is called flooding the zone, which I alluded to earlier when I said 60% of Americans say they get conflicting information about the same thing. So this strategy is basically just throwing all kinds of information out there, right? You'll hear this story on this news, somebody else posts something on social media, you hear something else from a different news source. And each one of those things is giving you a competing narrative in your head. And so there's so much, the zone is flooded with so much information that people give up. They get skeptical of finding the truth and they give up the search. And so instead of finding what the actual thing is, what the real facts are, we tend to either say nothing is true or it doesn't matter what's true, or we retreat into what we call our own biases, or I'm just going to stick with what I've always known and what I've always thought because it's a lot it's a lot more difficult to find out what's true. And what's true anyway is kind of where we land. So the goal, and that's actually the goal of sort of the new propaganda problem, is disengagement and division, that we're all so busy sort of yelling at each other and we're divided and we just disengage from it. And that allows sort of this, the purveyors of disinformation to get to a place where they've achieved their goal, right? It's not getting behind a single narrative, it's getting everybody so divided that we can't move forward or have a conversation about important topics. So that's where we're sitting. It's a very complicated place to sit. It makes it very difficult to determine what's true, what's not true. It falls a lot on us, which frankly, I'd say isn't fair. But we've also dismantled some of those systems of editors and fact checkers and journalism rooms that were doing that work for us before. And those don't exist anymore. So what can we do to verify what we're seeing and to be better at information? Because if we're shaping our online reality, which we're all doing, every time we post something, every time we share something, we're shaping what other people see. So we're actually all participants as well, which is really different from the old media environment as well. We used to just be the consumers of information, but every time you post something, every time you share something, you're now a creator too, which means we all kind of have a little bit of editorial responsibility about what it is we're doing online. So what can we do? A group of researchers out in Stanford did a really interesting study not too long ago. And what they did was they took 3 groups of people. They took students, brand new first semester students. They took groups of faculty who should theoretically be a little more information savvy. And they took groups of fact checkers and they gave them information tasks. They would show them websites and say, we want you to use whatever methods you think are good and tell us whether or not you think this website is giving us credible information. So what they found was that fact checkers used what we call a lateral reading strategy. What they did was they had the website up on one tab and they would open a new tab and immediately start Googling or looking at news sites or trying to independently verify what they were finding on the original site. Students and faculty, and part of this is one of those things that we learned in higher education. The way you learn from something is to do what we call a deep dive. You read it carefully and closely, right? You stay on the site itself and you explore the About Us section. You read on the site. You read carefully and closely to get meaning from a text. That's a very higher education thing to say. But that deep dive where you stayed on the site, basically is what most of the students and the faculty members did. And the fact checkers blew them both out of the water, statistically speaking, because they were able to independently verify things, and they usually came to the right conclusion more often, but they also came to the right conclusion more quickly. And so that lateral reading strategy, instead of staying on the website itself and trying to analyze the site, independently verifying what we find on the site, turned out to be a much, much better strategy. And so there's some real research behind this idea of how we can get better at analyzing what we find on any given website. So I'm going to actually stop sharing this presentation for a moment and go through a case study that I've done very briefly with students in class, but it demonstrates quickly what this strategy actually looks like. So I'm going to share a different screen now. We're going to go online. We're actually going to go live on Google, and we're going to take a look at a website. So let me share that screen. Give me a moment. Okay. So if you do a Google search on asthma, which is a common condition, many people have it. One of the first things that you often see, not all the time, because we've already talked about how our Google searches aren't always the same, is a site called asthma.com, right? And with a name like asthma.com, it seems like it would be official. It very much has a lot of sort of official feeling things happening. It asks us if we need help managing our asthma. It has, an e-guide to find out about our asthma. It's talking to our doctor if I'm a parent. It has some FAQs. It's a really nicely put together site. It seems to have a lot of good information on the front. And so what I would do in a class is I would ask students to tell me who's responsible for this site, who wrote it, who's the author. And it would take them a little while, and a lot of times they'd scroll right down to the bottom and we'd find out, so the website is funded and developed by GSK, or they'd click on the contact us. So what we're doing right now is the deep dive that I'm talking about. We're staying on the site. So, and it's, it gives me some pre-guided areas where I could go to get more information. If I go to their FAQs, it looks pretty official. So in other words, I'm having trouble determining exactly who that author is other than it's GSK. And I don't know who GSK is. So, in that study that we talked about, this might be one of the things where it's kind of like, I think it's credible, but it looks credible. And if it looks credible and it was high in my results list, then I'm probably not going to question it too much. But what the fact checkers did was they immediately went to Google and they searched for GSK. And what we find, if you are not already familiar, is that GSK is a pharmaceutical company who sells asthma drugs. So if we scroll down past the GSK information, and maybe we'll go out to Wikipedia to see what Wikipedia has to say about GSK, and then they also should have, and the reason why I like Wikipedia isn't even necessarily the information on it, it's the references at the bottom that link me out to other news stories about them, other information about them. But we find that, GSK has had some issues in the past, right? They pleaded guilty to promotion of drugs for unapproved uses. They paid kickbacks to physicians in the US. It was the largest healthcare fraud case. Now, again, they have paid their dues there, but it gives you a better sense of who is responsible for this content. It gives us a different lens to see the information through. So it's not necessarily that the information out here is wrong or bad. It's that the job of this site is to sell. It's not to inform me about my asthma. It's not to actually help me find the best drug for my asthma. It's basically to sell asthma drugs. And now that we have that information, we can look at this site really differently. And all it took was opening another tab and Googling the organization that was responsible for that particular information. So that lateral reading strategy can prove really useful to get to quick information and verify what we're finding online. So I'm going to rejoin my original presentation so we can finish that piece of it. If you'll bear with me while I switch screens one more time. So that's the kind of exercise that I use when I'm teaching my students, is let's go to a site and let's try and find out who's responsible for that information. What is the site designed to do? Is it designed to sell me something? Is it designed to entertain me? Is it designed to persuade me of something? A lot of political action sites are like that. Or is it designed to inform me of something? Whatever it's designed to do should influence how I take that information and assign it a level of credibility. Again, GSK can't, misrepresent themselves online, but they're certainly not going to give me my full range of asthma medication options. They're going to show me what they have a vested interest in, which is selling me this particular product. So the things we want to ask ourselves every time we look at information, and it's a lot of work, I'm not going to lie, it puts a burden on the information consumer. But when we think about the stakes involved, sharing information that's not correct, sharing information that can sow things like divisiveness, it makes it all the more important that since we're information creators, that we ask these questions before we decide to give information credibility or we decide to share information with other people. So who's behind it? Who's your author? Is it an organization? Is it a company? Is it a person? Who's the anyone? I always say anyone. Now that we're in the post-gatekeeper environment, anyone can post information online. And I want everybody to take just a minute to think about all the anyones you know, all of them, right? Maybe the anyones whose opinions you think are well thought out and well founded, people who are well educated and have an expertise in a particular area, and all the anyones who are kind of like, oh, I'm not sure that's those people we argue with over Thanksgiving dinner, and so anyone can now post something online without a gatekeeper, without an editor, and make it look official and true and credible. So we need to know who our anyone is. Who's the anyone? And not just who they are, but what do other sources say about them? And that's what the next pieces of it. What does the evidence say? Is there science behind it? Is there data behind this? Are they backing up the claims that they're making with actual information, right? Because science isn't perfect, but what science does is it takes the best knowledge we have right now and it lets us figure out what we know today and then ask better questions tomorrow. So the goal of science isn't actually to arrive at an answer. If somebody says they have the capital T, capital A answer, the answer, they're probably not doing science. What we're doing is we're trying to figure out the best thing that we know right now based on all the data that we have and then continuing to learn more. And that's what's cool about science, but that's also what makes it. So what is the evidence saying? What do we know right now? What are experts in the field saying? So for instance, the whole reason why I was asked to give this presentation is I'm a librarian. I went to graduate school and studied information. I have extended education in my field. We didn't just ask somebody off the street to talk to you about this. We went to an expert in this field. Now, I'm not an expert in all fields. right? You wouldn't want to come to me to ask about asthma medication because that's not my expertise. But we do have to say that expertise matters to a certain point, that if you have a background and an education in a particular field, that should hold some weight. And then what are other sources saying about this particular information? Is it verified by credible sources as well? You know, and doing that, pop open another tab, do some searches about it, try and verify the information independently. So there's some strategies that we can use. Anybody can use, right? I mean, it would be nice if we had more gatekeeping online. That's going to take some regulatory behavior or some legal issues that we personally, individually, while maybe we can advocate for, it don't help us today. What can we do today to make sure that we are looking at information carefully, that we are thinking about it critically, and before we give it any credibility or share it, you know, giving it that evaluative look. One is that lateral reading strategy. It's one of the best things you can do. Think like a fact checker. Open up another tab, Google it, check other sources. What are other sources online saying? What is the evidence saying? They make a claim about X, Y, or Z. Is that actually true? You know, so do a little other searching by using that lateral reading strategy. Using what they call click restraint. And what that means is not going with the thing at the top of the list. Google and go. So you just Google it, you take the first thing and off you go. That's your answer. So click restraint means you Google it and you wait. You don't click on anything right away. You scroll down through your results. You take a look at things like the dates, right? Almost every Google results list has a list of dates. Some things are very outdated and sort of percolate to the top of a Google results list for all the reasons we've talked about. Take a look at that little bit of snippet text. How much is it actually related to your topic? How much of it is actually accurate? Go down one or two more pages in the search result, because every time we do a Google search, we get something like 1 million or sometimes even 1 billion results, and we only take the very first one. That's putting a lot of faith in that Google algorithm to put the best information at the top, but we've already talked about why that may not be happening. So dig down just a little further before you click on a result, or click on several results and see how they line up together. Think before you share. We're now the editors. If you think about it that way, before you post something online, before you share something on your feed, think about it as if you were an editor, like a newspaper editor, because you're acting in that capacity, in that way on that platform. You are providing information to your audience. And so verifying that it's true before we share it, you know, more than things like jokes or, you know, pictures of our kids and stuff like that, but information, news stories, things like that, we want to make sure that it's right. Because especially on social media, it gets particularly muddled. If you and I are friends on social media, chances are I'm going to give a story that you post more weight because I trust you. And so there's a intermediary trust thing happening on social media where we ascribe credibility to the story because we ascribe credibility to the person posting it. Again, human psychology working sort of against us in this digital environment. Check those dates, check the snippet text, and then really kind of try and sit back from our own biases. We all have them, everybody. Again, I say this to my students, to my faculty, to myself. Everybody comes to the table thinking something. This is my opinion on this particular topic. But my opinion doesn't hold the same weight as fact. And opinion can often inflame a conversation. So if a post is using big emotional language, or it's using images that really generate a strong emotional response, double check it before you share it, because usually it's designed to do that. It's designed to do exactly what we were talking about, that flooding the zone problem is. It's designed to just create a whole bunch of information, whether it's accurate or not, to get people talking past each other as opposed to each other and entrenching into their own biases. Everybody has their own biases, and we're sort of responsible for examining those as we're all participating in this new information environment. And because what we do online influences what we see online, these strategies become really, really important for us to do before we go down that digital road. So here are some helpful sites that I use all the time when I want to double check something. I mean, you can just open up a tab in Wikipedia and Google, and those things are great to do too. But these sites are very, very good at double checking. So you receive something that feels like it might be an internet legend, right? It might be a hoax, you're not sure, or somebody's making a wild claim about something somebody said in a news story. And you're like, it checks the box on this path. It checks that box on, is it designed to inflame my emotions, right? So it checks that box. So I want to double check. Let's see what other fact checkers are saying about it. And there are sites that are designed and dedicated to fact checking. And these are 3 of the best ones online that librarians use all the time, that fact checkers regularly contribute to and use. Snopes is a great site that I use all the time. That's particularly good for like internet legends and hoaxes and things like that. Factcheck.org is an excellent organization that allows you to, especially when politicians are making claims, to verify it against actual data and facts. And the same thing with PolitiFact, which I believe is .com. I'll double check that. But each one of these 3 sites, and there are more, but these are 3 of the largest credible fact-checking websites that libraries and librarians and folks who deal with information use to share that information to fact check, but also that consumers, just regular people, can use to check stuff that shows up in our social media feeds and our Google feeds and things like that, to determine, you know, what we're talking about there, that is this good information or not. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we're going to come back to our group room. And we've got about 15 minutes left. So I did want to open this up to questions. I don't see any that popped up in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead. We're going to unmute folks. You know, obviously we're asking everybody to play nice, but if you have a question about anything that we've talked about, then we can go ahead and open the floor to questions. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute some folks, and we can open the floor to questions.
Okay.
So if you want to unmute yourself, it's down at the bottom of the screen. You'll see down in the lower left-hand corner, there should be a little microphone, and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay. So I have a question.
Okay, go right ahead.
Many times I have wanted to fact check something on Snopes, and I really don't know how to do it.
Okay. So the key then is to kind of pull out the main idea of the thing you're trying to fact check, right? So everybody's gotten one of those like emails about the African prince sending you money kind of hoax. Does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say that, right? Okay. So that's a perfect example. So what you want to do is pull out, and this is a good just sort of based research strategy, pull out like the main idea, like African prince and money, and just put those terms in. Don't type out a full question or copy and paste a lot of text, because then, you know, the search engine isn't matching things as well. So try and boil it down, whatever it is that you're trying to figure out. You know, did this politician say this? So just put the politician's name in the main claim or something along those lines, right? So boil it down to the main idea, get rid of all the extra words, and just type those things in. That should get you better results. If you're still unsure though, and this is where I'm going to put in a plug, ask your local librarians. Do you know who loves fact checking stuff? Librarians. So, and many libraries, we have a chat, a virtual chat set up for our students at Northern Essex Community College, but most public libraries also have a chat with a librarian function on their website. So if you're not sure and you're trying to figure something out, librarians are marvelous resources if you can't figure it out on your own. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
You said about like Google, where you get like 1 million or 1 billion hits,
Yep.
and they're ranked.
Yep.
Are they getting paid off by companies to like put their ad first or something like that? It seems like I Google something and these places are snagging me, and I'm not really getting what I'm looking for.
Right. So there's two things happening there. The first thing is that yes, companies can pay for placement. They have to be labeled as ads though, but it's very subtle how it's labeled as an ad. So it's not, even though the thing at the top of your list, it will say that it's an ad, it's very small text, it's not always obvious. So yes, paid placement is a thing on Google. Once you get down to what they call the raw results or the organic results of your search, those search results are based on a couple of things. Number one, it's based on relevance, but that relevance is decided by where have you gone online before? What other sites have you visited online before? But also what's a very popular link that other people have visited before. So the most popular, that's one of the reasons why if we do a Google, a lot of times we see Wikipedia as like one of the top 3 sites. Yes, it's because Wikipedia is a super popular site. And because it's popular, it's ranked at the top. And because it's ranked at the top, people click on it and we see what sort of happens there, right? So what often happens is what we call a self-perpetuating cycle of something that pops up at the top of a search. But Wikipedia can be edited by anybody. Literally, I can open Wikipedia right now and change it. It's an open source platform. So we want to be careful. Again, the short answer to your question is kind of. And that's why this is such an important skill to learn, is because sometimes it's hard to tell what's an ad. Sometimes we're not sure if our search results are actually giving us the best answer first, right? It's paying attention to everything else that we're doing online. I don't know if everybody's ever had this. I think I said this. So you're searching for something in Google and then you go over to Facebook and there's an ad for it right there, right? Yeah. Yes. I find that really sketchy, but yes. It's because it's constantly, all of these algorithms, all these little programs happening behind the scenes are paying attention to where you go online, what you buy, what you do. And that's why those things keep popping up in your feeds, is because it knows you live in Chelmsford. It probably knows about how old you are. It knows kind of what your political affiliations are. It knows what you bought on Amazon last week. It knows whether you have grandkids or not, because you're posting all that stuff, right? And all of the big tech platforms are sharing your information. So it's a little, right, but it kind of brings home why it's so important for us to be really aware that that's how information is being structured. So it's a good question with a hard answer. And Google is very opaque about its algorithms. It does not allow people to examine how it ranks things, that they consider that proprietary information. And so what we have to do is look at the results of it and then work with that. So I hope that answered your question. Was that okay? Other questions, other thoughts?
I have a question.
Sure.
Pete from Telemedia.
Hi.
Are there better search engines than Google? Are there more objective? I've heard of some others. I know there's others. I never use them.
Right. So Google is the big player. Most recent market reports put Google, the actual Google search engine, somewhere around 87 to 92% of search engine share. So they are the monster. They're the monster in the ring, right? There are other search engines that do not do that same kind of tracking. The one that I use personally on my own personal devices is called DuckDuckGo. I'm going to put that in the chat. And so it is an excellent, it's a search engine. And so it looks a little different than Google. Sometimes the results don't seem quite as relevant. And part of that is because it's not doing that same personalization thing that it was doing, that Google does. But DuckDuckGo is a search engine that does not track as much of that information. It tracks as much as it needs to answer your question, but doesn't do that same sort of what I call ambient monitoring that Google does, that Bing does, that Yahoo, all the major players do it. So there are some more privacy oriented engines, but they're not as popular because Google's the big guy in the ring, right? So, and it's also comes sort of pre-installed on all your stuff, right? So that's another thing. You kind of have to go out of your way to find a different browser. Firefox does a better job too, but that's a browser as opposed to a search engine. This is where we get into the technical parts that sometimes confuse folks. But if you want to try a different search engine, instead of going to www.google.com, just do your search, try DuckDuckGo and use that as your search engine. It does less tracking, but one of the, even so, if you're logged into your Gmail, but you're on Gmail, I mean, Gmail is very clear, like they're reading your email. So, and by reading your email, I don't mean that in a sort of like, they're reading individually, like what you wrote, but like they're collectively, scraping your email for keywords and things that allow them to post links, post results that are tailored to what you're doing online. So Google's got its hands in lots of different pots that makes it hard to get away from it. Which is why these strategies are, even if you're using a browser that has higher privacy settings, why these strategies are still necessary. So,
Can I ask a question related to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Firefox has, you can right-click a site and open in a new private window.
Yes.
And the same thing with Chrome. You can open in an incognito window. What exactly does that mean?
So incognito windows are a way to also increase your privacy while you're staying in a browser. So this is where it gets a little muddled. So a browser is the way that you access the internet. So in other words, that's Chrome, usually Internet Explorer, or now Edge. They just changed over to Edge, but Internet Explorer, Firefox. That's essentially the program that runs the internet. While you're in a browser, you can bring up a search engine, which is what does that work. So that's Google or DuckDuckGo. It's easy to conflate the two, right? That a browser is a search engine. They are slightly different. One is a program and one is a web-based search function in that program, right? So you can run Google not on Chrome, right? You know what I'm saying? Or you can be in Chrome and use DuckDuckGo. What the incognito window does is it uses that browser. So you're in the browser and you use a private window or an incognito window. Is that also limits, but doesn't stop, the personal information that is gathered from you as you're surfing the web, right? So it limits the amount of cookies and little trackers that are put on your device so that when you go from one site to another, they know where you're going. You're like, those cookies. So you see sometimes a little window pop up that says, do you accept cookies? And we always say yes, because we have to, right? But what that cookie is, it's a good way to think about it, is it's a little bitty breadcrumb, right? We're Hansel and Gretel, and we're leaving these little breadcrumbs behind us through the forest of the internet. And so every site we go to knows where our little cookies were, right? So those breadcrumbs put together a picture of where we've been, what we do, what we like, who we talk to, all of that stuff while we're online. Incognito windows limit the number of those little breadcrumbs that are placed, if that's a good analogy to use. So it doesn't eliminate them. There are some times that you have to agree to add those things in, whether you're using incognito or private or not, in order to actually use the site. We see a lot of that as well. You must agree to our terms to use XYZ. Which gets around some of that. So, but yes, that's another good step to take. So good steps to take: use incognito browsing or private windows, use a non-Google search engine like DuckDuckGo, make sure that we're analyzing, and then use those cognitive critical thinking skills that we're talking about today. So that's an excellent question. It is another privacy measure you can take, but it doesn't sort of inoculate you against some of it. It helps, but it's not a solution. Does that make sense? I forget who asked the question, but I'm hoping that answered the question.
Yeah, that did answer the question. Thank you.
Great.
I have a question.
We have just a couple minutes left, so go ahead.
So how long do cookies stay out there wherever there is? Can you
Permanently.
delete cookies permanently?
Unless you deliberately delete them from your account. Unless you can delete them.
How do you do that?
If you go into, so the way you want to do it is you want to, on any browser, you should be able to find something that's called your history or your browsing history. Usually it's located in the settings, somewhere in your upper right corner, not always, but you want to find your history. If you go into your history, you'll find that you are able to delete where you've gone, delete cookies. The problem with that is it also, and be very aware of this, it will also delete any things like your saved passwords. So you normally go somewhere, right? You hop online and you don't have to remember the password because you had it save your password for you. So part of that, right? Anything that you've signed into, so be very aware of that. So if you haven't written down your passwords, don't delete your cookies yet because you're going to have to redo those. That's part of how it's part of how all of these platforms keep you giving them information. Do you want to stay signed in so you don't have to remember your password next time? Do you want to continue, right? As you sign into something, it'll just remember your sign on and your password. And you're like, great, that's convenient. And it absolutely is. I have sites that I visit that I have my password saved to. But what that also means is that that little breadcrumb is still sitting there, right? So we are giving these trade-offs, right? It's a trade-off between our privacy and how much we're being tracked. And then that convenience of signing in and signing out every time, of remembering which password for which account, of having our things linked together, right? So we're trading, and this is the thing that I'm trying to get, it's not necessarily a bad trade, but the problem is most people don't even realize they've traded, right? So convenience is a good thing. We don't want to have to remember 900 different passwords for 900 different sites, especially if we use them regularly. But on the other hand, when we do that, we're giving a trade-off. We're saying, okay, here's the trade. I'm taking the convenience of not having to sign into this site every time I use it to allow this staying on our site. So I want to really caution you before deleting your whole history to think about what sites you are regularly on that has your password saved to it, so that you don't delete something that you then have to like recreate a whole account, because that can happen. Your account will still be out there, but you just won't remember what your sign-in credentials were when it asks you, with your login name and your password. So that's another way to delete those. You can delete your cookie history. You can absolutely wipe it clean, but now you've lost some convenience. And that's where the trade-off is happening.
I don't care.
And it is. It's it's a bit of a tangle, honestly, and it puts a lot of responsibility on individual users. It really does, and not always without being very transparent about how these things work behind the scenes. So, there are some levels of privacy that people are happy to give up in order to have certain amounts of convenience, but not even realizing that the trade-off is happening is kind of where we are as a society, or not caring, right? We've just disengaged with it. Everybody's tracking, so who cares? But it matters because it shapes what we're doing and what we see online. So it understanding that that's the dynamic is really important.
Okay, thank you.
We're bumping up against time unless somebody else has a burning question.
No, we're good. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, but I do want to encourage you to use your local libraries and your local librarians. They've gone through the same kind of training I have. We've all gone to get graduate degrees in information science, and this is part of what we work with. So understanding what's happening behind the scenes, how we can protect our privacy, determining if something that you got sent is true or false. Your local library and librarians are really just excellent resources for this kind of stuff. And I really want to thank Natalie for inviting me and having me talk to you folks today. She has my contact information. If you have questions that you'd like me to follow up on, I'm happy to touch base with anybody after the session as well. So I'm going to hand it back to Natalie in case there's anything she needs to say as we wrap up.
Thank you so much for coming, and appreciate the
Thank you
today. So thank you everybody for joining.
Okay.
Thank you, fact checker. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks,
so
Right.
Good luck out there in the digital world, everybody.